So here to talk through this Yajilin by David Altizio called 4x4 Grid. And that theme is obviously from the 16 clues, this tilted square. It also has a really interesting set of 2x2 boxes that get filled in. And this will be a theme that comes up during the solve. We'll again today have a paper solve, speed solve form of going through this puzzle where you'll see different examples of how we'll solve Yajilin for speed. One thing to note about these 2x2 squares is we either have 4 ends come into them or we just have 2 ends to come into them. So that's something that we'll run into during the solve. The one that has 2 ends come into it has a single shaded cell, and so there's also only 1 or 2 shaded cells in this box, and that's kind of where the break-in for the puzzle happens. It happens by looking at these 2 clues together. So this is a 2 up next to another 2 up, and it leads to some pretty crowded spaces. So where I've colored these by how the clues look, let's color them a different way, which is how we're actually able to shade in parts of these. This is similar to stuff we've sometimes shown in battleships and other puzzles. I can take a maximum of 1 in this blue group. In this red 2x2 square, I can only shade 1 of these. Notice if I shaded 2 of these, I'd have 2 isolated cells that the loop can't pass into and exit from. I also can only shade 1 of these in orange. I can't shade these 2 that are diagonally adjacent. And I similarly can't shade these 2 that are diagonally adjacent in green. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 areas that the 4 shaded cells from these clues are going to be in. And it's actually easier than this if you've actually looked at the rest of the clues to get started. So this 0 left eliminates 1 of those in green, and that this cell is right near a single channel eliminates this in green. And so the first place you can make progress going along this path is to see that top cell in blue. That top cell here has to be shaded in. The next place is to work off of it. We can come back to this kind of view. Knowing that we have to have a cell shaded in a space, I can't also shade this cell because then I don't corner into the space right. So this is open. And then notice if I shade this bottom cell in orange, it's going to force the loop to come through all 3 of these in red. So that also gets eliminated, and that puts in this X cell. And that's kind of where in my notation for the spaces to get in the next pieces of the solving of the puzzle, that's how I was thinking through it. There's one more tension that's going to arise during the solve, and we'll see. I probably look at the 1 up clue to do this, but that tension is going to come from this left side of the grid in green. So where we don't actually know like how the path goes here, if I actually sort of back this out, what we can't have is green be closed on itself. And so where this right now is a border we don't cross, if we ended up with like a border here we didn't cross, we would then have the loop potentially closing on itself, and that's where an example of the problem is actually this shading from the 2 up clue, but we'll see how we run into it. In this shading, you don't have a way to get into and out from this upper left corner. So those are the different themes to go alongside the solve, but let's now watch my sort of blind solve video and see how fast we get through it. And certainly the first places I look, I don't know immediately to go to those 2 up clues, but they are likely suspects because any adjacent medium to large clues are worth looking at. I instead put the 0 left in immediately, and then I'm looking across this 3 up. And I'm trying to see how the cells split across the 2 spaces that are pointed at by them. I can get as many as 2 in the lower set, so I have to have at least 1 at the top. I'm also recognizing I can't have 3 at the top, so I either have a 2 1 split or a 1-2 split, and that's what my notes there on paper are sort of showing. I'm sketching some possibilities across this 2 up clue because it's pretty limited. I'm seeing that I have to take at least 1 of the top 2 cells that are available in row 1 or 3, but I don't know more than that. I was sketching in one option in case I took like the 5th row cell, and did that force a problem? And it didn't immediately force a problem, but it is making me think about placements in the space. And so I'm not being as deliberate as I was in the penpaw video I was just showing, but I am giving a case like, what if the 2 up was never using that 1st row, and in doing that I quickly break the puzzle and recognize I can mark off that cell at the top of that column, and that's forcing that 1st shaded cell for sure. So that's one reason I want to do the penpaw preface here, is to just give you the logical path, which you won't always see in a speed solve video, but it's something that comes through. In the speed solve, I actually look back at that 1 left clue and also mark in a note for that X being in one of those 3 cells, which we'll come back to in a second. But this is probably where I'm now mentally looking across this 2 up in some space, and I'm actually recognizing I have some limitations. Looks like I actually see that the 1 up fails. And often what I'll do is when I visualize something looks broken, I'll actually write it in and make sure it's broken. That's my way of slowing myself down from making a bad deduction. But I have eliminated 1 cell from that 1 up. That's putting in this X. It's making me now see that actually I can't put an X in that top for the 2 up cells. So I get this shaded cell for sure. from these eliminations. That puts in that X for the remaining 2-up clue in the 5th column. That's going to mark off 2 cells pretty quickly as in white. And then let's see how I break through the last step here. So I now have 3 cells that need to be shaded. And often in a speed solving mode, I will look across them to recognize where they move together. In this case, this notation is saying these cells have to be shaded together. So either they're both up or they're both down is the first thing I'm noting. And I'm actually linking them over. Look at that. I'm linking them over to the 3rd column as well. They also move up and down together there. So these 3 cells all get shaded together and they're in one of 2 states of the world. So I'm now looking across those and recognizing like that line segment coming up is always going to be part of the loop. That's not going to be as critical, I think, as seeing how you close down the whole loop if you are in the down form of this shading. So let's see what observation gets me to recognize that limitation. And it should be what I was showing in the video, like this down form moves this channel out and then the loop ends get stuck. So I do see the loop end issue in the upper left corner. That means all those cells are in the up state, not the down state, so they all get shaded quickly. The loop pieces around them get marked in quickly. So this is where tracking the tensions in the grid and then working through the either or choices are actually a pretty good route in Yajilin, because the shaded squares often do have like a knight's move separation, how they have to fit into the grid. In this puzzle, for sure they do for those 3 as I was going through in the speed solve. I can only get 1 in that 2 down clue in that 6th column, and that puts another then in the bottom. And so on paper, I'm going to mark, look at that, I'm going to mark that there is 1 loop end coming across that space. So I need 1 more loop end that gets into that lower left corner that's coming through that cell. I'm trying to make sense of all the clues. The 1 down, so I just looked at, I'm going to look at the 1 left from the 3rd row and see at least which cells are possible for it. That one that would lead to a single isolated cell is not, so it has an either or choice. The 3 left is still somewhat open. What I'm now seeing though is that I can't use the bottommost cell, and so that puts the X up top, and the X is not just a shading node, it is about the loop ends that can come into those 2x2 squares, and so marking off that edge, I actually can move the loop around. I now know for sure I can only take 1 in the bottom with that 3 up, and so I have to put 2 in the top, so I'm trying to figure out how the 2 go in the top of the grid. Looks like I've got to take the topmost cell, not the bottom cell. That X is going to force the loop end out from that edge as I'm just drawing now. So again, this is how my notation helps me see also the paths of the loop. So it's both saying there's 1 shaded cell in it. It's also saying the loop is not going straight through those edges. This 3 up has 1 X in one of those cells, but in either state, it's going to take a left turn. And that's going to fulfill the 1 down clue, which fulfills these other clues. So we're getting the lower left corner very quickly now by just propagating through the notes. Running through an X moves the X immediately up, so that's how I don't have to look back at the number clues when I'm in speed solving mode. And now getting to some tension where I'm thinking about these loop ends coming back together in this 2x2 square, and can they both then get out as well? And that has to be compatible with both the 3 up clue and the 1 down clue. So I'm mapping out some of those spaces and recognizing, well, in both those versions, I always have to take that loop end out the lower right. In practice, though, I then know where that 1 down clue in the 4th most column from the right has to go. That's forcing the loop to pass through that 2x2 square as well. Putting a lot of that side of the grid. I've got to have these loop ends stay apart so the upper right of the loop connects with the rest of the loop. I'm going to finish at the top, it looks like, next. Looking across those clues and seeing how we would have an issue if we took the top cell with how the loop goes. I now still have to have that 1 right clue, though, in the 3rd row work out. So this is just tracking back all the clues, marking off the ones I've looked at. I'm looking at the ones that are still open, the 1 downs in the rightmost columns are the key ones here. They each have 3 options. I'm now looking across them for which don't work most. The one nearest the loop on the right side looks very broken. I'm now looking at both of the ones that touch to that X because they're going to force 2 placements right away and seeing if they both fail. There's an issue that's just at that cell up above with the lower one, and so that gives me the shading for one, gives me shading for the other, and so that is a speed solve of this very hard Saturday puzzle. So hopefully got something from seeing the logical seed. The logical seed is something that I ran into not exactly by logic, but at least by speed solving modes in the right place with the 2 2-up clues. And then the rest of my paper solve is very much along a logical path, and hopefully you appreciate the different views of looking at these 3 shaded cells that move together versus what we had in these steps of how you can break apart the grid to these 2x2 blocks and eventually get the placements to work out through those considerations. So thanks very much for this great puzzle, David. Hopefully it's a great conclusion for the week, although we have a Sunday surprise coming, and we'll see you again soon.